Friday at 5. This is our weekly destination to convene to talk about education, the impact of education, the national education policy. Today we are talking about something extremely important about access, about, this is the future. When I see around me, unless there is equal access, at least there is a semblance of equal access. Now think about this. How many people are able to access this ICSL Convo? That will tell you that we live in an unequal country. And as long as this kind of inequality persists in our daily lives, school education doesn't reach the masses. Again, this is a minuscule minority that we are talking about who have access to online, digital, constructively critical subjects like what we are about to discuss today. That is what we are about. We want to reach out to the mass, make a difference. Today, our speakers have done that in their daily lives. Today, they have, the kind of people we have lined up today, they have made a difference in society and have fought for access for the underprivileged. So what's the subject today? Let me formally introduce it. Do the proposed public philanthropic partnerships create new opportunities for you? And the way we want to go about it is we will go with our speakers, and then we will obviously introduce a question answer period and take as many questions as possible. So if anyone attended our session last week, be specific, be clear with your questions so that we can take as many questions and take this forward. Before I ask Atul to talk about it, let me just lay the ground map and introduce my speakers. First, Mr. G. Balasubramanian is the former Director Academics of the CBSC and Chairperson of the Board of Advisors of ICSL. He's one of the most recognized faces in school education across the country. His futuristic views, seated in a pragmatic approach, has inspired thousands of school teachers and leaders. So the idea is to pick his brains on this very important subject that we are about to discuss today. Ms. Sangeeta Krishnan served as Director of Curriculum and Training for Bharti Foundation. Under her leadership, the philanthropic arm of Airtel opened several schools in rural areas, recruited and trained local teachers to teach in these schools. She's well versed with the challenges of bringing children back to school in the rural areas. And all of us know the real challenges that suburban India or rural India even faces today. So it's not something that we have to drill it into you. Mr. MP Sharma, a national hockey player, currently the Senior Vice President, Philanthropic Foundation that runs 27 schools, most of which are in the rural areas. In his previous professional assignments, he has spearheaded the efforts of philanthropies to help educate the underprivileged section of society. He understands the mindsets and challenges of philanthropists and philanthropies. Obviously, my dear friend Atul Nischal, whose brainchild this is, the mover behind ICSL and this Convo, will speak to you at length. And Anirban Aditya, who chairs the Aditya Group of Schools, will talk to you as an entrepreneur. Now, what are the things that I want my panelists to keep in mind? One is obviously time, because in order to make this meaningful and engaging, do please stick to a time which we will sort of say at the start of your talk, because the idea is to put this all in a bucket and thereafter reach out to as many educators, leaders who have joined this Convo. The second hygiene announcement, I have made this last week. Please register on our website. And all you need to do is register once. You will be notified of this Convo week in, week out. Every week we will discuss something different. Next week we'll discuss pedagogy. We'll talk about something profoundly interesting week in, week out. And this is all round the year. Finally, what is this all about? Why do we keep coming back on a Friday when you think, okay, my week has ended and it's time to go back home and rest a bit and get freedom from this online education and Zoom or whatever you want to call it? We prolong this by 1 hour. For what? Because this empowers you. Think about it. Has there been constructive, meaningful dialogue in the education space in the past? No. There has been, shouting, slanging matches on television, news television. That's the norm. That's absolutely fine these days. Even if there is education and we are talking about education policy, we know what will happen in a news television debate. Political parties will bash each other up. Meaningful discussions will not happen. This forum, let me make it very, very clear, is not political. We have no political alignments. We have nothing to do with politics as far as this forum is concerned. We are interested in constructively critical dialogue because we think this forum will make a difference to our society, to parents, to teachers, to educators, to leaders, to eventually the Ministry of Education, and frankly, the student is at the core of this ICSL Convo. We want the student to benefit. We want the student to benefit from the ideas that will be tabled by my speakers, that will be tabled by my panelists, and that is why we have come together. We have come together to make a difference to you, to society, and to everyone who is present here. So Atul, on that note, if I can go to you now, and to again, I mean, the way we do it, why don't you set out the broad contours of discussion today, and thereafter I will try and sum up and then take the discussion forward with my other speakers also. But for the real kickoff, over to Atul Nischal.
Thank you very much, Boria. And starting very quickly, I think whenever we think about dropout rates and whenever we think about gross enrollment ratio, that the government wants to achieve 100% gross enrollment ratio, we think of this as a problem of the public school system. Since most of us who are logged in right now are part of the private school ecosystem, we feel this is not our problem, and this is the problem that the government has to deal with. And I want to make 2 points before I get on to talking about what is covered in the policy article by article. The first important point is, how do we understand the meaning of bringing a child to school? How do we understand whether a child is attending school or no? We have right now approximately 200 people who are attending this webinar. But the fact is that if you are not listening to the issues that are being raised, thoughts that are being brought up, and you're not thinking about them, then the big question is, are you really attending the convo? What do we mean by saying that a child is attending school? Getting him inside the campus walls is what attending means, and therefore we should say that the child is now part of the education system. Well, that's not true if you look into your hearts. That's not what we mean by achieving a gross enrollment ratio. We don't need to bring all the kids inside the campus. What we really need to do is focus on engagement of the child in the learning process. So it is very important, and that particular aspect of education, to engage a child in learning, is something that all of us educators are struggling with. We have 40 students in a classroom, and there are very few students who are actively asking questions. There are very few students who are focused on what the teacher is trying to explain. And therefore, I would like to propose that all of you should think of GER as really not the gross enrollment ratio, but what we as private school leaders need to do is focus on gross engagement ratio. So there is a new GER which is more relevant to us as private school leaders. Till the time we make sure that each child is engaged in the class, till the time we know that each student in our school is engaged in learning, we have not achieved a GER of 100%, and that should be the aim. Luckily, now where is the correlation between these two things? The steps in the national education policy that the government is proposing to achieve 100% GER, which is their GER, could actually motivate you and inspire you and work for you to achieve 100% GER in your schools. For you, the GER is the gross engagement ratio. So I don't think we need to overlook what the government is trying to do to increase enrollment. We can adapt those steps and put it in our schools immediately to make sure that we have a higher engagement ratio. That's the first point. The second very important part is that we feel that somehow we are disconnected from the public school system just because we are a philanthropy, we are independent, we are a NGO, we run a private school, and therefore we are totally different from them. But this feeling of disconnectedness is a big myth. I've been recently watching a serial on Netflix called Connected, and you will be amazed as to how each of our different elements are connected to different things without our realizing it. Whatever happens in the government school system has and will impact what is happening in the private school system. And ignoring that connection is a myth. So we need to be very careful about what the government is trying to do in their own section. Having said that, let me quickly point out examples of what I've meant by these two things. In Article 3.2, the government states that we do not have great infrastructure for our public school system, and therefore we need to invest in creating schools. We need to invest in upgrading schools. We need to invest in hiring teachers, etc. Now, Delhi has already done that in some portion. If you look at some of the government schools in Delhi, the infrastructure has been lifted considerably. They are much more cleaner schools. There are toilets. The classrooms are very airy. They are lighted. And it could definitely compete with a private budget school in our country. Now, what happens if the government starts spending money, if the states decide to start spending money on uplifting the infrastructure? One of the pitches for the private budget schools in the country has been that they provide a better infrastructure. Well, that difference is going to go smaller. And I think as people who are involved with private schools, we need to start focusing on infrastructure. In Article 3.3, the government says the building infrastructure is not enough. We need to also track the learning levels and progress of each child. Now, that is something we will also need to do in our schools to build engagement of children. We really can't engage a child if we do not track the learning levels of the child. And I think if the government is coming up with these policies, there's a cue for us that we can start doing that too. In Article 3.4, another very important point, if we are realizing that the policy says that you can't just bring them in a school and keep them without making sure that their interest in studies, interest in learning is delivered. So it's not about those boring lectures anymore. It's not about, one teacher teaching 100 kids anymore. The policy clearly mandates that we will have to change our teaching style. We will have to design a curriculum that delivers a learning, it delivers something to a child that the child is interested in. Well, this is something that can help us improve our engagement ratio as well. And in Article 3.6, which is slightly different now, where we are realizing that maybe the government is saying we alone can't do it, and therefore we need philanthropies to come with us and partner with us. So it's the same PPP model, but instead of a public-private partnership, they're talking about public philanthropy partnership. There are a lot of philanthropists, and we have Anirban with us today. We have Mr. MP Sharma with us today. They have been, and Sangeeta has been associated with philanthropic work. And there are challenges to create those PPP models. But there is an option for each one of us to increase our footprint in the country and serve many more students if we really want to take education to a particular level. And lastly, the important point that the policy makes in Article 3.7 is that we have to involve community and alumni. I won't be surprised if in a year or two, the government starts a national portal to hire volunteers for the education system. And this is not something that is not doable. The moment the national portal for hiring volunteers comes up, you will see a lot of people out there volunteering their work for the education system. Now, this is again something that is not a copyright, or that is not a jurisdiction of the government alone. We as schools can, on our website, start inviting volunteers to join us and help us engage students in their learning process. I think these are some of the main points that are covered in the NEP, according to me. And I would love to hear other views, Boria, as we move ahead. But I think these are the emphasis point is think of GER as gross engagement ratio and work towards achieving that 100%. Thank you, Boria.
Okay. So Atul, as usual, quite brilliantly has laid out the contours. Community engagement, how do you reach there? GER, he's given a new definition of GER. He speaks about volunteering process. Is that something the government and the private school entrepreneurs will look at? Can we look at that? Is that a meaningful way forward? Somebody who's been there, done that, as I said, former director of academics of CBSE and chairperson of the board of advisors for ICSL. Privilege to welcome you, Mr. G. Balasubramanian, to the floor. It's yours. And all I will say is, for the sake of time, if you could stick to 10 minutes, because we will want to use your ideas and sort of move on to the others and then put all of these questions into our bucket list. Over to you, Mr. Balasubramanian.
Thank you, Dr. Boria. And I must compliment Dr. Atul for his brilliant insight that he has given. But when you look at some of the fundamentals of this policy, I see that from the year 1966-68, when Curtailing Commission report came, and in 1986, when the National Policy of Education came, almost the concept and the problems, challenges discussed are all almost the same. They get only the verbs and the adjectives and the nouns and the statistics. The data all has only moved ahead and moved diverse. But some of the basic issues have already continued to remain as they are. So that's one thing that we need to look at, that very clearly says that we have not addressed the fundamentals of the issue, and we have been addressing more on the superficiality of the problems over there. That's one thing. So when you look at some of the fundamental issues, I would like to raise a question based on what Atul said. GER, whether it's a gross enrollment ratio or engagement ratio. And that takes me to a very important and vital aspect of what is learning all about, right? Is learning happening only in the school? Where people, when the school infrastructure was not there, people were they learning and what they were learning? So we have excluded the informal learning, what was happening to every human being and which was empowering. And we have defined literacy in terms of what we deliver. Therefore, the new policy focuses rather on the learnability of the learner rather than the learning of the learner, which I think if you bring this paradigm shift into the process of dropouts, you will find that a large section of the people who are dropped out still become learners because we have not been able to provide them the kind of learning experiences they need for which they have an aptitude, right? So probably we had brought more on a Western dimension what learning is all about to satisfy some of the statistics which are required at the global level. But nevertheless, there are some very important points over there. With my experience of traveling across the country, being in the board, I have seen that there are far remote schools over there where the access is absolutely limited and the children have absolutely no access to walk in, right? And there are villages, if you go it, I don't want to name the states for personal considerations, but I must tell you that there are states where the children, especially the girls, have not been sent to the schools at all for the issues of safety, because of gender bias, because of the cultural sensitivity, and we have not adequately educated our populace to create that kind of inclusivity in terms of education. Therefore, number one, our definition of learning has to change. Now that we have technology available, instead of fighting with what is called the access is not there. When I look at the ratio here, it's very interesting. The 16-17 statistics indicate at a GER of 95.1, for the class 1, but when it comes to class 11 and 12, it is 51.3. Nearly 49% of the people, 40% of the people drop out at this point of time. And that's exactly when the Kothari Commission talked about diversification of education to vocational education. That was one of the reasons that skill force people should be developed over there. But we did not pick up on the idea. We always considered that learning is all about the prosperity of an intellectual domain. And therefore, I think it's very important we should accept learning in a broader perspective rather than what you call, what the child is capable of delivering what the teacher wants, right? And one of the very important aspects is in terms of increasing the learnability of the children. Educating the parent is as much important than educating the child. At this point of time, we have not taken an inclusive society, and also the gender bias in education has existed in many states together. And you wouldn't believe if I could say that we have had fake schools, we have had fake students, and just to fill in the statistics, and even these statistics, when we talk of, I don't know how many transparent they are. Therefore, we need to develop a very transparent system, thanks to technology, thanks to our ability to reach. And I think we need to bring a paradigm shift even in our approach to dealing with this problem by reaching out to the people, by taking, learning to their doors rather than bringing them saying that we don't have school. Nevertheless, one very important point before I conclude, I would like to say, this gives us a lot of scope for expanding the scope of education. Very fact that if you look at the number of schools that you have, for every 100 schools at the primary level, we have got only 50 middle schools, and we have got only 20 secondary schools, and we have got only 9 senior schools available. That really means that there is a huge opportunity for PPP, call it private, call it philanthropic, doesn't matter. But the government should get on more liberal notes on trusting the system and facilitating expansion of education, not through formal structures, but through informal structures. Our modes of certification, our modes of acknowledgement of the competency of learning should also change. I would stop there at this point of time and then leave it to people for questions later. Thank you, Dr. Boria.
See, I've always believed if you actually know a subject, you don't need 15 or 20 minutes to make your points. You can make your points in 5 minutes to 7 minutes, and even then make a very, very significant and meaningful contribution, exactly what Mr. Balasubramanian just made. And his point about dropouts from 90% to 50% is highlighted by the last stat he gave. Number of senior schools and secondary schools compared to the number of primary schools. So if you correlate the two, you will understand what he's talking about. Very important intervention. Lots of questions will obviously be raised as a result. I will take those questions later because you've also given us 3 extra minutes. So we'll add that to our question time. It's time to move on to Sangeeta Krishnan. Over to you, Sangeeta. And then, as I said, once we take our presentations, we'll go into the question session. Over to you, Sangeeta.
Thank you, Boria, and good evening, everybody. Now, thank you, Bala sir, for giving us a good insight into the skewed ratio of primary schools versus the middle and the secondary schools. I fully agree with you. Of course, what you said is backed by data, and I've seen it on the ground. When I worked in the villages, we've seen that while almost every village has a primary school, because according to the RTE, you need to have a primary school at every 2 kilometers, not more than 2 kilometers walking distance from the child's home. But there is no norm which says how far a middle school or a senior or a senior secondary school would be. And so immediately after primary, the question in the parents' mind was, now what? What after class 5? So initially, when we started the Bharati Foundation also, the model was to have primary schools. And then we realized it doesn't work because parents may prefer to send their children here or to a government school, But in the government schools, what we realize in the public schools, I mean, when we say public schools, we really mean the government schools. So in India, it often is misconstructed. Delhi public school is not a public school, it's a private school. So that misnomer first needs to get cleared in everybody's minds, that all of us are actually belonging to the private sector of education. and the government sector is the public sector. So when we kind of look at the strategies that the government had employed to get children into school, they provided the midday meals, they've given monetary stipends, they've given uniforms and books, they've given incentives to teachers, they did accessibility for the primary schools. But all this system actually led to not just ghost teachers in the schools, which we've often heard of, but also ghost students, which Ms. Bala sir also mentioned, that whether those children were actually there or not. Not to overcome that, we try to put something in place, but the systemic rot that comes in actually creates more problems for us. But in the cities, and especially in Delhi, we've all seen, many of us are from Delhi, and we've all seen that the EWS scheme, economically weaker sections of the society, 25% of the seats in the private schools have been completely reserved for the economically weaker sections. Initially, there was a lot of problems related to this admission also, rich people, we've seen the movie also, in which they showed that very rich people would get into, buy a seat for economically weaker sections. But fortunately, this problem has been solved in Delhi. So there is this partnership. This is also, a way that partnership between the public and the private, because now these seats come from the government. The Directorate of Education sends these children to the private schools. There are problems related to it, but what is the solution? Enhancing government schools. Now that is the only way forward actually. Enhancing the quality of education in the government schools. And when we say quality of education, I really like the term that Atul used, gross engagement ratio. Once you get the child involved in learning, engaged with learning, he starts enjoying learning, engagement means it becomes joyful learning. The child doesn't want to stay away from school. You can see the difference. Every teacher who's sitting here will vouch for it. When children who enjoy learning, enjoy school, they don't want to stay away from school. So whether it is a government school, a private school, the level of engagement for the children has to be enhanced. And it cannot be the same level of engagement for all 40 children, because this is a big misnomer. One size fits all. This, in India, we have this whole thing that I'm the teacher, I will tell you what to do. I'm the teacher, I know this, and I will tell you, I have to inform you about it. It doesn't happen. Children are explorers, they are curious, they are inquisitive. And unless we fan this and provide experiential learning for them, those experiences in the classroom where children can explore and learn, engagement, the level of engagement is not going to go. So what I like about the NEP is that they focused a lot on the learning levels. They've tried to kind of put a new curriculum framework which is going to come out, Part of it is already there, the early childhood one with the NCRT and the early childhood things. But there is going to be lots of new things that are going to come. Again, that's going to be a broad framework. We all need to understand that, there has to be localized, customized, in fact, customized, personalized learning has to start happening. It is going to happen. And that will improve the gross engagement ratios in the class. And also very, very important point that has already been brought up, but I want to again kind of emphasize that school enrollment does not mean that the child is learning, because we see very low learning levels, both in private schools and in public schools. Why do students of private schools need to go for tuitions? Obviously, they're not learning in schools, or the expectations from the parents have are different. So this teaching to the test,
Have we lost Sangeeta?
I think there is a problem with the internet, maybe.
Yeah, the internet dropped. We'll try and reconnect with Sangeeta. That's always a question with digital technology and the forum. But I think she was making some very important points, and coming to the point that you made about engagement, and actually was talking about that. So there was an overlap in the points that the two of you guys were making. So we have that in our bucket list. Several of you are actually posting your questions. I saw Shilpi do that. I saw somebody else do that. Please don't post your questions. It's not needed. Just put your hands up. I mean, if you do that, we will try and take as many questions as possible. That's the whole point of this. Sangeeta was making this point about a lot of you being from Delhi. The purpose of ICSL is to move beyond Delhi. Delhi is not India.
Hello.
Yeah, ma'am. You're back there.
Yeah,
Good.
I'm
Yeah,
back
go
there.
for it.
I just lost the connection for a split
No problem.
of a second. Yeah. So, it's very, very important that children, when we talk about learning, it has to be not the knowledge-driven learning. It has to be the ability to learn, continuous learning, lifelong learner. And we've all been talking this jargon for a long time, but we really need to make it happen. In the government sector, we see that there are many, many reasons for dropouts. And unless those reasons are actually, those factors, those reasons for dropouts are addressed, how are we going to retain children? One is poverty. Are we going to look at how we are going to help families overcome poverty? And education is a very good way to help them overcome poverty. But education not for the sake of getting a degree, education for getting a skill which makes them more employable, makes them also a better human being. And then availability, accessibility we've spoken about. Now there are learning problems, which I said, we have children who have lots of learning problems, but in our country, all across, whether we go to east, west, north, south, we realize that, we do not address those learning problems. And I'm not just talking of special needs children, even normal children have some kind of learning problems. They're not disabilities, but they're minor problems, and they need to be addressed. So a system of counselors need to be put in schools, both in public and private schools have counselors, but most of the counselors are very generic. They do not understand the learning problems of the children. And basically teachers need to be trained to identify and help children to get over these learning problems. And these can easily be got over with minor interventions here and there. The next factor is lack of motivation and interest, both on part of teachers as well as students. Why are the children not interested in coming to school? Because lessons are not interesting. And why are teachers not interested? Because in the public system, we find, in the public school system, there is hardly any accountability. We teach for the sake of teaching, putting a tick on the box. Ye bhi padha liya, ye bhi padha liya, ye bhi padha liya. Do we ever sit back as a teacher? Do we reflect how well have my children learned this? Do we ask ourselves, have we done what was really required for each child to learn? That kind of motivation on the part of teachers also, that attitude change and the mindset change from the parents also. Very often it is the parents who are dictating what needs to be done in the classrooms. Parents decide in the pre-primary ki ABCD bhi padhao or 1 to 10 bhi padhao. But why when it's not required? So that mindset change of the parents, motivation and attitude change of the teachers is very, very much required. Poor teaching is of course related to it. And another very big factor, which is a big challenge for our public school system, the government schools, is the migration. People come to villages, to Punjab or to Haryana during the sowing and the harvesting season. Then they go back with their families to the Bimaru states, basically Bihar, Eastern UP, maybe Bengal. What happens to their children? They keep moving with the parents. Are they not losing out on this experience of learning? And parents are quite helpless in this regard. I've seen this in the villages, and therefore this whole system, Rajasthan had a very good, I would say a very good program that they had put in place, was called the Bridge program. So every time a new admission came into the class, the child was allowed. There were, volunteers coming into the government schools who were helping the children to bridge and come up to the minimum level of the class in a month or 2 months' time through this rapid or the Bridge program. the Ministry of Human Resources have also put NUPA in place to track students. You know, the data of the Aadhaar card of the students is being tracked through NUPA. So though we say now the ghost students are disappearing in the public schools, but that is not the case, because still state-wise there has been no complete consolidation. So I think as public schools, we need to come up, and we are mostly in the cities. So we need to take up responsibility of adopting a school in the neighborhood. Adopt a government school in the neighborhood. Share your best practices with them. Let your senior students go and teach them. When we had the National Literacy Mission, in the 80s, this used to run in our public schools. And we had children from private schools going into the, into the Jhuggi Jhopri clusters, trying to teach them, trying to engage with. So that level of community engagement and the community volunteering programs like Teach for India, Asim Premji Foundation, Center Square Foundation, they're all doing a marvelous job. But these are drops in the ocean. And we have to increase such drops so that the flow becomes faster, and these private schools will take over the responsibility of the public schools. And for the private schools, like Atul said, we are going to have a challenge. When the public schools, the government schools improve, our enrollments are going to drop. Have we ever thought of it? It's going to be a challenge. If the government school in my neighborhood becomes really good, why will the parents spend thousands of rupees to send the child to my school? I really need to think of that. So therefore, it is a win-win situation when we all work together. So
thanks, Sangeeta.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll stop you there because I've got to come back to you and move to Mr. Sharma because of the issue of time, but several important points made. Several. I mean, accountability of teachers, the issue of learning, the question of dropouts, the issue of empowerment. Atul and Sangeeta use different terms, but one spoke about volunteers, one spoke about a very similar platform. Both of them were making similar points. So lots to ponder about. But before that, questions, I will go to Mr. Sharma now. Mr. Sharma, over to you, and please formulate your questions. And as I said, this is not about Delhi or about Calcutta. This is a pan-India movement that ICSL is trying to do. So keep that in mind. Mr. Sharma, over to you.
Hello. Am I audible, Mr. Boria?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
I may not be, you're
not visible. You're not visible.
My camera has some problem, I think.
Doesn't matter. Go for it. Your audio is there.
Mr. Boria, you rightly said, India doesn't live in Delhi and Madras and in Kolkata or Chennai. India lives in villages. You see, our problem is twofold. One fold is the schools which are located in the cosmopolitan cities, more like Delhi, Chennai, where Bala sir rightly pointed out and Atul rightly pointed out, the GER is an issue. I would like to, in a brief, address this issue of GER. You see, the problem with our academicians is that they have not still become the educationists. The focus in our schools, the syllabus, basically we are syllabus operators. The syllabus rolls out in schools through the lesson plan. Our lesson plan is only Gyan oriented. We are never willing to hand over the charge to a student. We want to control them. That's how our lesson plan, if you look at the Bloom taxonomy, only focus onto the, knowledge application maximum. It doesn't go to analysis, synthesis, evaluation. That indicates very clearly the psychomotor skills. The engagement of the student is almost zero. It is only the monologuing going on in the school. That is the large problem with the private school, as rightly corrected by Sangeeta, that we are basically not public school, we are basically private school. In private school, well, this is one of the largest problem where, and I am reminded of Alvin Toffler. Toffler says very clearly, we have to unlearn, relearn, and then we have to switch over. Maybe we've been able to switch over to online teaching, but we are teaching all the same what we used to teach in the classroom. That is number one. Number two, you see, there is large scope of partnership, what Atul referred as philanthropist private partnership. It still remains, Atul, the PPP, whether it is private public or it is government will have to learn to give a space to the private players. Alone government may not be able to, because the problem is enormous. And especially the government has put in a lot of focus. Let us not criticize the governments. The succeeding governments have done a lot of good. ICDS scheme, Integrated Child Development Scheme, I have been involved. The scheme started somewhere in 70s, and it has done tremendous amount of good work, because it is not the educationists only see it from reading writing point of view. Our population in the rural belt has a problem of poverty, which very rightly indicated by Sangeeta, and then of health, dehumanization and all. If the public school or the private school decides to annex the pre-primary, what we call ECCE, into the fold of a regular school, then we'll have to also focus on humanization, on their nutrition, on it is quite possible that it is quite feasible to have a partnership with philanthropists. But philanthropists, the problem is, I have worked with NGOs, I have worked with private sector, they want to do, be it Bharti, be it Mahindra, be it anywhere, they want to do it at their terms. So government will, in case the government wishes to have a partnership, they'll have to educate even the philanthropists that they don't create a dependency. They create, they put the system into their own 2 feet, and I think it is a very good paper. But once it comes on the road, it is a concept paper without a feet. So the country, with a lot of positive mind, the political will is there, but people will have to change. That will take a little bit of a time. I think we can definitely make it through this policy. This is the first time which you see the government will to address very crucial issues which is another very huge. Mr. Boria, I'll take an opportunity of addressing that, is the mafia which is available in the education even. The kind of degrees in B.Ed given to this, you don't have to go to the B.Ed college. You get the degree at home. So that mafia will be addressed now, because this 4 years integrated policy, which is connected with the universities, will definitely address to that. The teachers have to be a part of a learning community. So far they were not. So once this is put in toto, and I think ICSL is doing a commendable job in this, and we have a lot of scope of doing a philanthropist. I think our chief in the S. Chan is doing a wonderful philanthropy work through the ICSL, and we stand a lot of scope to do a partnership with the government and with the private players who are there in the field of education. For example, I don't want to miss out also the Vedanta. You see, if you look at the Anganwadis, the best work which is done is by the Vedanta group by Agarwal through the Nand Ghars, which are there in 1200 in number. Thank you, Mr. Boria, and thank you, Atul.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Sharma. Strong words. Again, I mean, my point is, this is not about any particular group or any particular individual or any particular organization. This is a far, far more widespread, expansive scope discussion that we are trying to do. Some very important points made. I will move on to Anirban, because as I said, I want to take maximum questions. So not my time to speak much. Anirban, over to you, please.
Yeah. We have very less time left, so I want to finish things short. So one of the major points that I thought of saying it to you all is the land requirements. Based on the availability of land, government should allow schools to open with proportionate number of students and facilities. In today's urbanization spree, we see it is next to impossible to meet large land criteria. Hence, we are forced to go outskirts for cheaper land, thereby taking the facility away from where perhaps it's needed the most, or buy land at a premium which reflects heavily on the fees, thereby again taking education beyond the reach of the most. So the land criteria has to be a very important part which the government should focus on. The next thing is autonomy in creating management bodies and running the day-to-day of the business, day-to-day of the education system in the government schools. While government should have a vigilant eye on adhering to the norms and legalities, the day-to-day functioning should be completely left onto the private bodies, including the recruitment and the admissions. Of course, the government should have a look into it, but it should be left at the freedom in the applications has to be to the private bodies to ensure that the best standards and qualities are maintained. And what will also encourage the private partners, I think, is to work in a congenial set of guidelines that ensures that even if the private partners doesn't take money home, they are adequately protected not to pay out from their pocket. That is very important. How can we ensure that? So the government should also back the private parties, like the soft loans, the cheap loans for education institutions. Longer moratoriums, bailout packages are very important to sustain. So sustenance is very important to make a government school look like a private school. Also, the model has to be all the fixed assets are provided by the government and the movable assets are provided by the private parties. The last point that I have in terms of autonomy, the private players should also have the flexibility to decide which classes they wish to cater to. Under present norms for affiliation, the school has to have the bottom to all levels of classes. However, if we get an option that the middle school classes 5 to 8, the senior school 9 and 10, then the senior secondary school 11 and 12, they must have the right to choose depending upon the infrastructure that they have in their disposal. And today's topic is, the last thing that I want to conclude is we are all talking about how the government can help the private parties, how the government schools can be enriched with best qualities provided. But I would also want the private players to look the other way around. Like if your school is from 10 to 4, or it starts in the morning from 7 to 10, you have the primary section, then from 10 you have the senior section. We can also the private players can give their schools to the government, or the PPP model can also work the other way around, where the private school also provides the space, maybe in the evening, maybe during the weekends, where these poor children, the children who doesn't have money to, that the parents doesn't unable to pay, can come and enjoy and sit on the same benches which the other students sit, and have a feel of what a good or a bad or whatever you call. So it's not only about the government providing or helping us or providing these facilities. Even the schools after school hours can also be utilized, and we can think about it both. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all my speakers. Some extremely important points have been made. Not much time, so I'll rush into questions. Several hands have been raised, questions have been raised. Taposhi Bishash. Taposhi, if you are there, do you have a question? If you do, please can we have you unmute yourself and ask the question? Taposhi Bishash? You're not there? Okay, so let me go to other questions. Who's this? If anyone wants to ask a question urgently, can you please put your hand up so that I can get you? Manju, if we have to enhance GER joyful learning, we need to mitigate the fear of assessments among learners. So how do we overcome? Manju, if you're there, can you ask your
very
question?
much there. Yeah. Very
Go for
happy evening to all from Dubai. I am the head of assessment and examination, as well as personal social development of the students here. I heard these panelists, wonderful insight on NEP. My question is that to make this learning joyful, which is related to your gross engagement ratio, rather I would say ritual, most important thing, how should we take this shift of marks obsessed assessment to the assessment which should be enjoyed by the students and should be focused on their skill learning? And secondly, the type of faculty we are having, they have a very fossilized approach. So I think this NAP provides this faculty training. What is the take on the panelist on this?
Very, very important questions and points made. Sangeeta, if you take the first one, I'll go to Mr. Balasubramaniam for the second. Sangeeta for the first one. Sangeeta?
I think her connection is gone.
Okay, doesn't matter. So why don't you take the first one and we'll go to Mr. Balasubramaniam for the second.
So that's a great question, Manju. And I think the NEP, if you read the various clauses, and we're going to be discussing that next, I think in the next two convos in more detail, the government does plan to move away from rote learning. It does plan to move away from an assessment-driven education model, and it wants to make sure that thinking is developed by the child. So if you look at, even if you look at the chapter 2, which is on the basic numeracy, the basic foundational literacy and numeracy, they want even the younger kids up till grade 2 to start thinking mathematically. So I think in terms of providing provisions to move away from assessment, there is enough meat in the policy. However, there could be some apprehensions in terms of how fast some of these things can be addressed or implemented. But the movement has started happening. For example, I was reading either yesterday or today that Uttar Pradesh has already constituted a 17-member committee, which is being headed by the Deputy Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh to implement NEP in Uttar Pradesh. So if suppose some governments, some states have decided to move that fast, that within the same month when the NEP has been released, they are even forming implementation committees. I think we can optimistically look at some of the changes that could come up. I leave the teacher training question to Balaji.
Yeah, Mr. Balasubramaniam.
Yeah, I would also like to add, before I come to teacher training, one input for the first question. If you look at the national education policy, it talks about three-dimensional assessment of children: self-assessment, peer assessment, as well as the teacher-led assessment. I think the question addressed by our member from Dubai will find a right answer when you open up the assessment to self-assessment and peer assessment. And I think that will be a very holistic assessment. And I think the policy is very clear on that, and I'm looking forward to that coming through. Number two, number two, when it comes to the training of the teachers, I think that's going to be a very, very important job. And I want to make one point very clear that in a knowledge society where knowledge is getting redundant every 6 weeks, empowerment is has to be an ongoing process. Number one. So no organization, whether it's NCERT or NCERT, will be in a position to deliver all that empowerment packages by the time they complete one cycle. Is going to be 5 years. Therefore, we are in a society today where my teacher is going to be, assessed not by the principal, but by the student and the parents together. Therefore, self-learning is going to be a very, very important dimension for my teachers, and they cannot wait for any other organization to come and pat their back. You have done a job, and therefore you are promoted. It is an ongoing learning process, continuous learning process, and the present society of learning community says that you are not in a society where the teachers learn and communicate through a cascade effect to the children, but children and teacher are learning parallelly in a learning community. Probably my teacher will learn from the student in this process, and therefore I think we are in a parallel learning society. Therefore, the teaching, the competency of teaching has to be self-driven, self-motivated, and I only think that the teachers need a fire in the belly to go, to keep their job ahead.
Okay. Can we please have shorter answers, because I want more questions? So to all my panelists.
So Boria, may I just add a little thing,
Yeah.
For teacher training, it is, what Bala sir said, the teacher has to be self-driven to be learning and learning with the children, So both these things go hand in hand. But at the same time, it is very important that we have a system of, sharing best practices, learning from each other, mentoring, coaching, all that also has to go hand in hand for the teachers. Because very often in the rural sector, the teachers are very, very kind of lost in their own little, wells or in their tunnels, and they need to see the world outside, and that needs to happen more continuously.
Okay, I'll take 2-3 questions together and then go to my panelists. Meeta, you go first. I saw your hand up, Meeta. If you're there, I had your hand up, Meeta. If you can unmute yourself, Meeta.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I think the national education policy has already addressed the issue of dropout by dissolving the streams at senior secondary level and by introducing skill-based learning at the middle level school. So because they have realized that in public schools, that is in the government schools, the large number of students are worried about earning bread and butter at the age of say 13 to 14 years. So they want to skill them in certain areas so that by the time they graduate from school, they are ready to earn their livelihood, and they have a hope that yes, in school only we will learn what we need in our life, what we need to uplift our living or uplift our financial status. Because that was the one of many surveys have addressed that major reason of dropout in India is lack of resources and financial constraints of parents, and they are majorly worried about earning their bread and butter at this stage.
Okay, got it.
So I think the national policy has addressed.
Okay, that's more of a comment rather than a question. So thank you very much for that comment. I just got a question, I think, from, who was that? I think it was Sanjay Kumar. Sanjay Kumar, if you're there, Sanjay, please, can we have your question? Sanjay Kumar, if you're there.
My name?
Yes, was Sanjay Kumar. Otherwise, Manju, if you're there. What elements to be included to design skill-based curriculum for the attainment of independent learning? Manju, if you want to ask anything else. Manju, if you're there. I did get her question. If that was her question from Manju. There were quite a few questions. I'll actually read some of them because several of you had posted. So I'll read a couple and then go to my panelists to sort of sum it up, and if they want to address anything. Nancy Singh says, you have pointed out, and this is to Sangeeta, you have pointed out exactly, and it is the bitter truth which needs to be controlled. Ma'am, can public-private school work together, cross-sector education? Sangeeta, you can address that in your closing comments. Someone says, Maharashtra has also constituted an implementation committee. That is in response to what Atul said about Uttar Pradesh. Shumon Chavla says NEP, if applied in the desired manner, would definitely change the entire system. So, it's an important intervention. Ashu Suri says, that's why we call it a teacher learning process. So several comments coming up. What we can do, Atul, at some point, based on these comments, we should actually prepare something for our wall and put out these comments which will provoke offline debate, because it is online, we can only take a certain number of questions because of time, but offline, these are important comments being made by all of our attendees. So it is important to post these comments so that offline debate is welcome. So that's a suggestion we will take into account. I've posted the questions. Atul, you will have the last word as always. Before that, may I please quickly go to Sangeeta and to Mr. Balasubramaniam and to Mr. Sharma for closing comments. If Anirban, you also want to close, I'll come to you as well. First to Sangeeta. 1 minute
Okay,
closing comments. Yeah.
Thank you. So what somebody just asked that can we have this public-private partnership in the schools? Yes, it's very important. You know, as a society, if we have to move ahead, we have to bridge this economic divide. We have to bridge the social divide. And this has to begin with the schools, I believe. You know, it cannot happen in the society if we stay in our own ivory towers in the private schools. So very important, we have to find ways to bridge the divide and work together hand in hand, help each other and move on.
Okay. Mr. Balasubramaniam, your closing comments, your last 1 minute.
Yeah, well, I think that our definition of learning has got to change, because children learn whether they go to a school or not. They learn at home, they learn environmentally and other inputs over there. So I think we need to broaden the base, our approach to education, and include all that the child could learn. And as I said in the beginning, the learnability ability of a child has to be celebrated in whatever context he or she is there. And I think that is going to be the essence of the elimination of dropouts in school system.
Meenakshi, I see your hand up. If it's an important question and an urgent one, please go for it. I'll give you the time. Meenakshi, I just see your hand up. Meenakshi, if you're there. Quickly, Meenakshi, if I saw your hand up and was an urgent question, can you hear me?
Yeah, we'll need to unmute her.
Unmute Meenakshi if you can, please. There are 2 hands up. Meenakshi Chipa.
Meenakshi Chipa is some reason. Okay. I think she raised her hand and left.
Okay, good. There's Manju. Manju, can I can you unmute Manju if you can?
Yeah, just last question.
Yeah, go for it.
Just last question. Since we were talking about the skill-based learning and the faculty training to upgrade their skills, curriculum plays a major role. So what would you give advice to us to incorporate the elements to upgrade the curriculum or redesign the curriculum based on skill-based curriculum for attainment of independent learning?
Okay, Atul, why don't you take that?
So that's a really good question. I think we should wait for the new curriculum framework to come up. The way the information is coming, I think some drastic changes in the curriculum framework, and based on that, we will have to definitely go ahead and design a new curriculum. The way we have been teaching in the past is outdated. It's not going to fit into this policy, for sure.
Mr. Sharma, can I please come to you for your closing comments, Mr. Sharma? Are you there?
I think he's disconnected.
He's disconnected. Anirban, do you have anything else to say, or then I will ask Atul to close in the next 1 minute, and then I will use my couple of minutes to close the session as the moderator. Anirban, you have
two things to end this. I would want the government not to look at the private parties in a suspicious manner. We have to work together. And also the private schools should not always pass the buck to the government schools, that everything the government has to do. So there has to be a balanced approach. And the last thing, as we were talking about the rural schools mostly in today's discussion, the vocational courses is needed for the rural students, nothing else. That should be the focus. That will give them job in the future.
Okay, Meenakshi, you are unable to unmute yourself for some network problems. Apologies for that. That's the issue and challenge with technology. Atul, you're summing up in the next minute and a half, please.
So I'm a very optimistic guy by nature, and that's how I want the school education community to think about it. A lot of us have gone through public school systems. I have got an opportunity to go and meet teachers who are teaching in remote village schools in Uttarakhand. And I can tell you from my experience that there is no lack of motivation in those teachers. There are many motivated teachers. In fact, some of the students who are studying in our government school systems are more motivated than who are studying in the best of schools, in the best of cities. So I don't think the problem is that. The problem is synergies. The problem is the right interventions by the government. And to the way I look at it, this time it's going to be serious. We do have apprehensions because we have failed to implement previous policies, and therefore apprehensions have a ground. But let's not be too apprehensive. let's look at the positive side and do whatever we can do to implement the new education policy.
Okay, I will close on the note that all of you have actually been, you've traveled in a vehicle, and when you've come to a naka or a junction or a crossing, and you have an international visitor with you, and people are coming from everywhere. If there is a red light, somebody decides to walk exactly when a red light is on. Some other car comes and almost rams you. But the fact of the matter is, in India, even if such things happen, the naka functions, the junction functions, the traffic moves, because there is order behind every chaos. And that is India. India is all about order behind every chaos. Don't underestimate the power of this country. You know why? Because it has people like you. It has people like Atul Nischal and Priya Malhotra who dream of having ICSL. It has people like Mr. Balasubramaniam and Sangeeta Krishnan and Mr. Sharma and Anirban and each one of you who attend my sessions at ICSL Convos. You know why? Because you guys want to make a difference to this country. And that's what gives me hope. I am the eternal optimist who will always say that India has this unique power to surprise the world. And this national education policy will do the same, is exactly what my hope is. And that's why, however much we struggle, however much we are apprehensive, week in, week out, we will come back on the Friday at 5 o'clock to talk about this. Because unless you talk, unless you decide, unless you push, unless you commit, unless you are passionate, unless you are dedicated, unless you are determined, change can't happen. And there is only one constant in human life, and that's change. And that's what ICSL stands for. Thanks for all of you. Thanks to all of you for participating in this convo. Been an absolute pleasure to be able to do this. Atul Nischal, you're the backbone, you're the pivot of ICSL, and that's what makes this convo so enlightening and so entertaining. But till next Friday, do join us, register on our website, as I said, be part of our convos, be part of the change, for we will be back next Friday. Till then, thank you very much, and thanks for watching.